Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore. The federal government is stepping in against the state of Maryland, the Pocomoke City government, and the Worcester County Sheriff's Department over a discrimination and retaliation case behind the firing of 3 black police officers. On Wednesday, the Department of Justice announced that they filed a motion in support of the 3 men, asking for monetary compensation and to ensure that the workplace is free from discriminatory practices. And joining us for a briefing of how this case came to be are Taya Graham, correspondent for The Real News, and Janis, producer and reporter for The Real News. Thank you guys for being here.
Sure, thanks for having us.
Well, you both have been covering this case for over a year now, and there's a lot of layers to this, but it really starts with the firing of Kevin Sewell, who was the first ever black police chief of Pocomoke City. Tell us a little bit about Kevin.
Okay, so he worked in homicide and narcotics in Baltimore City for over 20 years, and he actually went to Pocomoke City for his second life. He was their first African-American police chief, and the town is about 4,000 people, evenly split between black and white. By all accounts, he was doing a great job. Crime dropped by 80%, and during the 4.5 years he was in charge, there wasn't a single murder. So it was a surprise to everyone in the community when he was dismissed.
One of the things that, just full disclosure, I wrote a book with Kelvin before he retired called Why Do We Kill? The Pathology of Murder in Baltimore. And in that book, he was highly critical of the zero tolerance policing in Baltimore, some of the aggressive tactics. So I think when he moved to Pocomoke, a small town, and became the chief, I think part of his goal was to change the way policing is done. And so he adopted, as Taya said, a community policing strategy where he walked. He got out of his car and literally walked the streets and ordered his officers to do the same. And through that, I think he built a relationship with the community that you could see that when he got fired, which is why it was so controversial. So it was really, I think his moving was about start doing something different.
And he was fired in 2015 by the mayor there, Bruce Morrison. So what led up to the firing of Kevin Sewell?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because when we went to that city council meeting and the town showed up in force, there was no answer as to why he was fired. Now, Kelvin eventually filed a lawsuit, and in it he alleges that he was fired for not firing an officer who filed an EEOC complaint. Now, this officer, Lieutenant Frank Savage, he was the first black officer in the Worcester County Drug Task Force. While he was there, he experienced racial discrimination, racial epithets. When he said he was having a problem with them using the N-word in the office, he got a bloody dead deer tail on the windshield of his car. Well, he filed a discrimination complaint. Kevin Sewell was asked to dismiss him, and when he said no, he says that's when he was fired.
And that's one of the big contentions in the suit, is that they continue to ask Kelvin to fire them. And since the suit has been filed, the city has continually refused to say why specifically they were fired. And there were rumors that it was because he was incompetent, but there was no proof of that, or the rumors about all sorts of stuff. We finally learned through our investigation that they went and confronted Kelvin. This is kind of funny. They went down to the police station just before he was fired and said, "You made an anonymous call to the police station," which sounds kind of absurd, right? Well, so they went to the police station, the council, sat there in his office and said, "Play the tape." And they played the tape, and Chief Sewell had called in and said, this is the chief, we have an anonymous tip.
Right.
So, that was one of the pretenses for firing him. Then they tried to get him for stealing a computer. They said that he had taken a computer out of his office, but he had taken a laptop home to do work. And they had been doing surveillance on him.
Yes.
And they saw him put a computer in the back of his car. But it turns out it was his daughter's computer, who was going to law school.
Yes, she was studying for the bar. Yes.
It seems from covering the story that it's constantly shifting why they wanted to fire him. But what Taya said, I think, is the main allegation of the lawsuit is really what happened.
So there was a little point of contention about whether or not the mayor even had the authority to fire him. Has that issue been resolved?
Well, no. According to the Pocomoke City Charter, the city manager is the person who's supposed to fire him. And obviously the mayor and the city council fired him. The city manager at the time, Russell Blake, had retired, or said he retired on July 26 or June 26, which is when Kelvin was fired. Of course, according to records that we've seen, that is a point of contention, that he really retired on June 30th. But it is very specific in the charter that the city manager must fire the police chief. So that, again, is another aspect of this controversy that has been a point of contention in city council meetings we covered.
And let me just add another aspect to this controversy. That city council is majority white. And so the city council is majority white. There's one African American on the city council, Councilwoman Diane Downing, and she told me in an interview that she experienced that she felt that she was out of the loop, that on occasions when she went to a council meeting, she could tell that they had information that she was not privy to. There were emails that were received by other council members that she didn't have access to. So the one African American on the city council who also stood up for Kelvin when they were trying to fire him has been out of the loop consistently.
So these three officers obviously dealing with the challenges behind the harassment and the EEOC claims that they filed. But I mean, things got really real in the community of Pocomoke once Kelvin Sewell was actually fired. Tell us about the reaction.
Well, I mean, there was tremendous passion because he had really connected. You know, his form of policing, community policing, had connected with especially the African American community who were not accustomed to seeing a police chief on the street, who were not accustomed to seeing officers walking their neighborhood and talking to them. And you know, he did stuff like would help people file college applications. He would help people find jobs if they wanted. They just weren't used to government being that either proactive or empathetic with their perspective. So you would think, you know, when you went to the council meetings, the passions were high. People were yelling, you know, people were angry. And they have, out of this grew, I think, even bigger than the story is the Citizens for Better Pocomoke that Taya can talk about a little bit.
Sure. Sure, and what I'd like to add is at that first city council meeting where the town was discovering that Kelvin had been fired, it was an even number of African American to white people there to find out why he'd been fired, and the people I spoke to, the white people I spoke to, supported him. At the second city council meeting, those white people were gone. So I don't know whether or not that they were told to stay on their side of the fence. One woman that I interviewed said that people were actually fearful to come forward in their support for Kelvin Sewell. But with the Citizens for a Better Pocomoke, this group is actually really amazing. It's led by two pastors, Reverend Jones and Pastor White. And they have these meetings in their church. And what they do is they have encouraged people to be more politically active, to read the charter, to go to city council meetings, even to put forward someone for District 2, is District 2 or District 1? Thank you. District 1 city council representative.
So they run their own candidates. So.
Right. So they went from basically, literally, being a sleepy town, trusting their city government, to being politically active and engaged and holding them accountable.
That's incredible. So it's really important to stress how major it is that the Department of Justice has elected to get involved in this because it appears that the mayor of Pocomoke who fired Kelvin Sewell did not have the legal authority to do so because there had been an EEOC claim filed. And for
they
people,
were protected.
Exactly. For people who don't know how the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission works, so when you file a discrimination claim against your employer, you have federal protections. They are not legally allowed to fire you. That's retaliation. So it appears as if these officers, or at least Kelvin, at minimum, was targeted for retaliation. But the other interesting part of that is that when the EEOC has finished their investigation, they allow the person, if they find in their favor, they allow them the option to sue. And most times it's at the person's own expense.
Yes.
So for the Department of Justice to step in on behalf of these officers is quite remarkable. Explain to us why this is so significant.
Well, think of one of the most significant cases recently in Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed by a police officer, and subsequently the Justice Department found tremendous structural racism, and they intervened there. So for the Justice Department to step into an employer dispute is monumental. It's landmark, you know, especially a dispute in a town of 4,000 people, which seems to me not to be, you know, you would say on the face of it, not affecting that many people. But I think, you know, what they found and discovered is that it is so egregious, and especially because it involves policing, which of course is a topic that we're all talking about now, and policing in communities of color, even more important. So I think you can't underestimate the involvement of the Justice Department, and also more importantly, you know, they took all the allegations that Kelvin and the other officers made in their lawsuit, and they adopted them into their lawsuit. So they believe fully that what Kelvin has been alleging, and Detective Savage and Lieutenant Green, they believe it to be true. And they say, you know, they want structural changes to the government because it's inherently like, you know, as a racially hostile environment.
But Stephen, now this pits the federal government against the state of Maryland. And there have to be big implications behind this because what the government is alleging is that the state of Maryland was complicit in a way, along with the Worcester County Sheriff's Department and the city of Pocomoke, of engaging in racist practices.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things that people don't realize is that Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosh is representing the state police in this matter because state police were involved in the Worcester County Task Force. You know, you have the Worcester County Sheriff's Department. You have, at one point, the Worcester County State's Attorney's Office was involved in the suit, but they're not at the moment. But yes, you're going to have your tax dollars, Maryland tax dollars, paying for the state of Maryland, who has actually hired another private attorney, to fight the federal government on a racial discrimination case that they say is open and shut. So that will present quite a dilemma for a state that purports to be progressive and says we're a blue state. Well, how can you be a blue state when you've really worked in a concerted effort to discriminate against these officers who everyone said was doing a great job? So yes, it is going to create quite a dilemma for the government here.
And, you know, the story really seems to involve the question of policing and specifically policing tactics and how policing is implemented in African-American communities.
Well, what I can do is I can describe for you some of the ways that Kelvin policed that were different. Stephen mentioned that he helped people fill out financial aid forms. He helped people get jobs at Tyson's Chicken or Breckman Construction. But he also got out of his car and walked. And that can't be underestimated because he actually got to know who the people in the community were, who were the mischief makers, as he called them, and who were the people that really weren't causing any sort of trouble at all. He actually helped one person who was a really severe alcoholic. He actually helped them get rehabilitation. So he wasn't just a police officer. He was a social worker. He was a guidance counselor. And one of the things he did was really reach out to the kids. In one case during Halloween, he would have the officers give out candy. He would have kids come into the police station, and he said he would take the smallest kid and put him up at front and put his police chief hat on him and say, this guy could be the chief of police. And so he really went out of his way to engage with the community, engage with the parents, engage with the kids.
Well, one thing that's interesting, we were just down there recently because there's been sort of an uptick in youth and teens on the streets. And it has upset a lot of residents because they're out all hours of the night getting into big fights. There was a big fight that was like 80 kids, and it required the response of all law enforcement agencies in the area. And so the city council proposed a curfew. And so we went out and talked to some of these kids, you know, to see what's going on. And one thing they said to us was, you know, Kelvin and his officers respected us, and we had a relationship with them. And that's what the people in town said. They didn't have these problems because they built relationships with people. Now, it seems that Pocomoke City is back to the sort of old formula, right, where they threw a couple kids to the ground, getting, you know, sort of aggressive tactics. So you see here the same problem. You know, you can police in a humane way, is at least what we learned in Pocomoke, and it can be done well for the benefit of all. But you can't. You have to have some relationship, and I think those relationships are missing from policing here in most cities.
And let me just add to that. The city council was considering levying a curfew on these kids. That was going to be their answer, to create more points of interaction for their police officers so that there could be more incidents, more possibility of brutality. So when you have kids, instead of reaching out to them, instead of talking to them, instead of having those officers go and say, what's going on here? Putting out a curfew only furthers this problem. And these kids, when I spoke to them, these weren't real troublemakers. This was a group of kids on bicycles that just wanted a place to hang out. These really weren't bad kids, in my opinion. And when I asked them what they needed, what would keep them off the corner, they said, we want a basketball court. They took down our basketball court. We just want a place to hang out, a basketball court and a couple benches.
Indeed, that those seem to be familiar sentiments echoed throughout communities that are dealing with over-policing, especially when on younger populations. But shortly after Kelvin filed his discrimination suit, the state prosecutor instigated an investigation into an accident that happened in 2014. It's a sort of key point to this case. And I know you attended the motions hearing yesterday. Can you tell us what happened there?
Well, first of all, so the accident occurred in 2014. A corrections officer was driving home and he hit two parked cars and he drove home. He called police, didn't come, and then he drove home. And I guess the point of contention for the prosecutor is saying that Kelvin and Lieutenant Green interfered in the investigation, that this man was drunk. So they charged Kelvin with 2 counts of misconduct and Lieutenant Green. Yesterday at the motions hearing, it was very interesting. What came up was Kelvin's attorneys filed a motion alleging there had been governmental misconduct in these charges because his lawyers had evidence that the state prosecutor's office was coordinating with the Worcester County State's Attorney's Office, which was one of the defendants in the lawsuit and one of the people who had been accused of discrimination. So they filed a motion asking for documents and emails that had been exchanged between the office of the state prosecutor and the Worcester County attorney, which of course would make this completely retaliation. But the judge denied the motion. So, and the state prosecutor is refusing to turn over the evidence. So I think this case raises a lot of questions, but also shows, the reach of law enforcement when things don't go their way. So, I think right now there is some question. I mean, I don't know what your impression was of that, but that didn't seem to go very well for Kelvin in that case.
No, actually, it didn't seem to be going very well. And despite the fact that he is the Washington Lawyers Committee defending him, they're not off to a good start, to be perfectly honest. And I think people who look at this case say that this is racially motivated payback.
But wait a minute, so hold on. Just to be clear, Kelvin Sewell is fighting a criminal charge.
Yes.
He's being charged criminally,
Yes.
while also trying to fight
Yes.
against the entities regarding his discrimination
And
claims.
criminal proceedings that started long after he had been fired, long after he had made the claims of discrimination. This started basically when he filed his lawsuit. So that's why people are questioning this. Now, the prosecutor got up in court and said, I'm being accused of misconduct. He said, either I committed misconduct or I didn't. It was very dramatic. But the thing is, the timing really, a fundamental question I wanted to ask him, he didn't want to be on camera, was why did this investigation take 2 years? This happened in 2014. Why now? So, I think it's going to be another point in this case that we have to continue following.
And I just want to add to that this investigation actually caused harm to Kelvin Sewell and his family. When he was being investigated, he had these investigators show up at his house, harass his wife, go to people, and he would get phone calls saying, I just had these 2 guys show up and ask me a whole bunch of questions about you. Another problem was that he was looking for a job after he left Pocomoke. So when he would go and get his interview, they say, your resume looks great, we love you, but come back to us when you're not being investigated. So this could have prevented him from being able to have a livelihood, as well as it was destroying his reputation.
So he and the other officers dealt with losing their jobs behind retaliation and then having some difficulty being rehired other places.
Right, exactly.
And now there are 2 of them, Lieutenant Green and Kelvin Sewell, are facing criminal charges.
Incredible. Well, we know that you guys have been tracking and reporting on this story for a while now.
Yes.
It may not even be a big stretch to say if your reporting helped to bring attention to the Department of Justice.
So.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for covering this, and keep us posted as to what happens with the DOJ proceedings now that they've gotten involved.
We will. Thank you.
Absolutely.
We're speaking with Taya Graham and Janis of the Real News Network, and I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore.